These are 20 hidden facts about The Tall T, the 1957 Western that critics largely ignored on release and then spent the next several decades struggling to explain why it was so much better than almost everything else playing at the same time. A 78-minute, low-budget Columbia Pictures programmer that opened on a double bill and vanished from the marquee within weeks. It now holds a perfect 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, sits in the Library of Congress National Film Registry, and gets name-dropped by Martin Scorsese, Clint Eastwood, and just about every serious film scholar who has spent time with it. This film needs no defense. What it needs is a closer look, because the story behind the screen is every bit as compelling as what's on it. Fact number 1. The Tall T was the first Elmore Leonard story ever adapted for the screen. Before Get Shorty, before Out of Sight, before Jackie Brown, before Justified, before any of the dozens of film and television adaptations that would eventually make Elmore Leonard one of the most produced authors in Hollywood history, there was a short story in a pulp magazine and a low-budget Western nobody expected to last. The film draws from The Captives, a novelette published in Argosy magazine in February of 1955, and Leonard had written the corrected typescript the year before, at a point in his career when he existed entirely outside of mainstream literary recognition. Every morning from 5 to 7 a.m., he worked at his living room table before driving to his day job at the Campbell Ewald Advertising Agency in Detroit, writing Chevrolet copy to pay the bills, sometimes hiding a yellow legal pad in his desk drawer to keep the fiction going through the workday. The corrected typescript now sits in the Elmore Leonard Archive at the University of South Carolina's Irvin Department of Rare Books and Special Collections, Box 48, under its original title, The Hostages. The name shifted to The Captives before publication. The film adapted it from that magazine story, and the whole thing opened to modest notices, played its double bill, and moved on. Nobody called it a landmark, but every Leonard adaptation that followed, the entire machinery of his Hollywood legacy, traces its origin back to this picture. Fact number 2. The script was originally written for John Wayne, not Randolph Scott. Screenwriter Bert Kennedy wrote the adaptation while under contract to Batjack, which was John Wayne's production company, and Wayne had purchased the rights to Leonard's story The Captives specifically to develop it as a vehicle for himself. None of that survived a business dispute. Wayne and his partner Robert Fellows dissolved their partnership. Fellows received the script rights as part of the settlement, and Fellows then sold those rights to Harry Joe Brown, who produced westerns at Columbia with Randolph Scott. What had been written for the biggest star in Hollywood became, through a chain of commercial accidents, one of the defining performances of Randolph Scott's career. Kennedy addressed the whole situation with characteristic economy when he later recalled, "I did some rewrite on it, not too much, but that was a good script. That was a good picture." And that's where it gets interesting, because the thought of John Wayne as Pat Brennan, the quiet and stripped-back rancher who refuses to bend even when everything is taken from him, changes the entire texture of the film in your imagination. The picture we know only exists because of a partnership split. Without that dissolution, The Tall T either becomes a Wayne picture at Batjack, or it never gets made at all, and Randolph Scott never finds the role that would define the final chapter of his career. Fact number 3. Richard Boone filmed this just 5 months before becoming Paladin. Released on April 2, 1957, The Tall T arrived in theaters exactly 5 months before the CBS premiere of Have Gun, Will Travel on September 14th of the same year. And that timing matters because Richard Boone's performance as Frank Usher is widely considered one of the finest villain turns in Western cinema. Dangerously appealing, almost sympathetic, carrying the weight of a man who seems to recognize his own moral failure even while committing it, Boone brought every tool he had to a role most actors would have treated as a paycheck. His training had been serious. The neighborhood playhouse under Sanford Meisner, the actor's studio, years of stage work before the cameras found him. Have Gun, Will Travel would run for 6 seasons and turn Boone into one of the most recognized faces in American television, with his character Paladin occupying the same morally gray space as Frank Usher, but landing on the other side of the line. Both men could have gone either way. Usher fell. Paladin most nights didn't. Watching The Tall T with that context in mind, knowing what was coming 5 months later, the performance picks up an additional register, the sense of an actor on the absolute cusp of stardom, choosing to be this precise and this unsettling in a picture most people considered a throwaway. Fact number 4. Elmore Leonard said only one actor across all his adaptations ever got the dialogue right. Leonard was famously protective of his dialogue, and his 10 rules of writing amounted to a set of instructions for staying out of the reader's way. So the central anxiety of his Hollywood career was whether actors would honor the rhythms and cadences he had worked so carefully to construct. About The Tall T specifically, His verdict was clear. Richard Boone recited the lines just the way I heard them when I wrote the story. What he said beyond that is the part worth sitting with, because across his entire career, across all the films and all the actors, Leonard identified only Boone as the one who got the spoken word precisely right. That carries considerable weight when you consider who came after. Paul Newman, Burt Reynolds, John Travolta, George Clooney, none of them earned that particular designation. Leonard also admitted his mixed feelings about the film overall, calling it something that takes about 20 minutes to get going, and being openly critical of the material Burt Kennedy added to the front end to pad the running time. He confirmed he had nothing to do with the people in Hollywood who made the movie, but Boone's performance stood outside all of that, separate from his reservations, the one thing he couldn't argue with. Fact number 5. Nobody knew what the T stood for, including the director and the writer. A young executive in New York invented the title, seemingly at random, and neither Bud Buttigieg nor Burt Kennedy knew what it meant when production began. Buttigieg wrote about it afterward with some exasperation. It took Bert and me 5 months to discover why and what the T stood for. Some young executive in New York thought of the tall T. We finally discovered the T came from the first letter in Ten Vorda, the owner of the ranch where Randy goes to buy the Brahma bull. A Brahma bull, a rancher named Ten Vorda, and a first initial that somebody in a New York office apparently decided sounded dangerous and Western. The marketing department ran with it, producing the tagline, taut, torrid, tremendous, T for terror, which is genuinely excellent copywriting, even if the title itself carried no intrinsic meaning. During production, the film had been called The Captives, matching Leonard's source story, and before that, The Tall Rider. But it needed a new name because another picture had already been registered under The Captives. What this means is that the title of one of the finest westerns ever made was essentially a marketing accident, one the director of the film couldn't decode for 5 months while he was still making it. Fact number 6. Maureen O'Sullivan was Mia Farrow's mother, and her other daughter inspired a Beatles song. Maureen O'Sullivan had been a Hollywood legend for decades before stepping in front of Buttigieg's camera, known as the original Jane Parker in 6 Tarzan films opposite Johnny Weissmuller, made between 1932 and 1942, and appearing alongside the era's biggest names in The Thin Man, David Copperfield, Anna Karenina, and A Day at the Races. She had been Vivien Leigh's classmate at finishing school in Paris, and Frank Borzage had discovered her at a horse show in Dublin in 1929. What most audiences in 1957 wouldn't have connected, and what many people still don't, is that O'Sullivan had 7 children with Australian-American director John Farrow, including Mia Farrow, who would become one of the defining actresses of the 1960s and 70s, and Prudence Farrow, whose tendency toward seclusion during the Beatles' visit to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in Rishikesh in 1968 prompted John Lennon to write Dear Prudence. 45 or 46 years old during filming, O'Sullivan was cast deliberately older than the typical Western heroine, and Doretta Mims reflects that choice in every scene, a woman who confesses without self-pity that she married a man she didn't love because she was afraid of being alone. That kind of emotional specificity didn't appear in most B-Westerns of the era, and per IMDb, of all the films O'Sullivan made in the later part of her career, she said she liked The Tall T the best. And if that caught you off guard, if you didn't know that the woman playing Doretta Mims was Mia Farrow's mother and that her other daughter inspired a Beatles song, then hit subscribe right now, because every fact on this list lands at that level. Fact number 7. The actor who played the most menacing henchman had never seen a horse before. Henry Silva's Chink is the more purely dangerous of the 2 henchmen in the picture. Cold where Billy Jack is volatile, without Frank Usher's ambivalence or anything resembling a conscience, and the performance is convincing enough that what Boudica revealed about Silva's first day on set comes as a genuine surprise. Boudica recalled the situation with evident affection. Henry Silva I just loved. He came down to play the part, and he had never seen a horse up close before, and he put the wrong foot in the stirrup. No prior experience with the animal he would spend the production riding, and yet Boudica noted that Silva rode fairly well by the time they wrapped. This lands differently when you remember the production schedule, somewhere between 12 and 18 shooting days, no time for extended rehearsal or riding lessons, everyone expected to arrive ready and perform. Under those conditions, putting the wrong foot in the stirrup on day 1 and delivering one of the more memorably chilling performances of the year, by the time the crew packed up and left Lone Pine, says something about Silva's athleticism, Buttigieg's efficiency as a director, or both working together in combination. Fact number 8. Director Bud Boudica was a trained professional matador. The opening of the tall T sends Randolph Scott's Pat Brennan into a bull-riding bet that costs him his horse, and on the surface that sequence functions as character introduction, showing us who Brennan is through what he does and what he loses, but it connects to the biography of the man behind the camera in a way that goes deeper than coincidence. Born Oscar Bodeker Jr. in Chicago in 1916, Bud Bodeker traveled to Mexico in 1939 and studied bullfighting under three professional matadors, Lorenzo Garza, Fermín Espinosa Saucedo, and Carlos Aruza. Professional status in the ring followed, and that expertise led directly to his first Hollywood work as technical advisor on Ruben Mamoulian's Blood and Sand in 1941, where he also choreographed Rita Hayworth's Matador dance sequence. His entry into filmmaking came through that advisory work, and his first significant film as director, Bullfighter and the Lady in 1951, produced by John Wayne's Batjack, earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Story. The arena shaped how he thought about everything that followed. His own explanation, "After Bulls, you're not afraid of studios or producers," and Martin Scorsese, reflecting on the visual grammar of the Ran-own westerns, identified the connection precisely when he observed, "The tension of movement in the frame lent the impression that any time anyone moved, it meant something. Then it dawned on me, it's a bullfight, where every movement means something. The bull at the opening of the tall T isn't decorative. Bodeker was signing his name." Fact number 9. If you watch carefully, you'll see a modern car in a scene set in the 1880s. At approximately the 5-minute and 52-second mark, a modern parked car sits visible behind the stagecoach in a film set in the post-Civil War American frontier. And while continuity errors in classic films form a beloved category of their own, this one carries a particular charm given what it reveals about how the Ran-own productions actually worked. Alabama Hills, near Lone Pine, California, was a functioning landscape in the 1950s, not a hermetically sealed set, and film crews descended on it, set up their equipment, and shot as fast as they could on schedules that left no room for extended location control. Given that the production wrapped in roughly 3 weeks on a budget under $500,000, the car in the background isn't a failure of attention so much as a record of velocity. An anachronistic smudge pot, a highway safety torch, also appears in the mine hideout scenes, which brings the total to 2 incorrect objects in a film that managed to be nearly perfect in every other respect. None of it registers on a first viewing. The performances are too strong and the pacing too exact. Both of those anachronisms sat unnoticed for decades, visible in plain sight, waiting for someone to pause the frame. Fact number 10. The film was shot in roughly 12 to 18 days and now holds a perfect Rotten Tomatoes score. Principal photography on the tall T began on July 16, 1956 at Alabama Hills, Lone Pine, California, specifically at Mather Ranch and Moffett Ranch near the town. And the most precisely documented accounts place the shooting window at 12 to 18 days within a roughly 3-week overall schedule. Bodeker claimed his films with Scott ran 18 days or fewer as a rule. The budget came in under $500,000 and possibly considerably less. The film runs 78 minutes, was shot in Technicolor, and was made by a small experienced crew that understood exactly what it was doing and had no time to second-guess itself. 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, based on 8 reviews, is what that production now holds. The IMDb rating sits at 7.3 out of 10. The Library of Congress added it to the National Film Registry in the year 2000, and the Criterion Collection released it in 4K with Dolby Vision HDR in July of 2023. 12 to 18 days, under $500,000, and a perfect critical score. The arithmetic was never supposed to work out that way. Fact number 11. The actor playing the villain was actually descended from American frontier royalty. Richard Boone's Frank Usher is a man who sees what Pat Brennan has and understands, at some level exactly what it cost him not to have it, and the performance works in part because Boone radiates the suggestion of a man who could have chosen differently. What makes that quality biographical as well as dramatic is the following. Boone descended directly from Squire Boone, the brother of frontiersman Daniel Boone, making him a literal inheritor of American frontier mythology while playing a man the frontier had chewed up and discarded. His background in other respects covered an unusual amount of ground. His mother, Cecile Beckerman, was the daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants, and his father was a corporate lawyer. Stanford University occupied him briefly before he left without a degree, after which he worked as an oil rigger, a bartender, a painter, and a writer. 4 years in the Pacific during World War II followed as a tail gunner on Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and then came the neighborhood playhouse under Sanford Meisner, the actor's studio, and a Broadway debut in 1947. That is a life of genuine range. which is exactly what the camera found when it pointed at him in the tall T. Fact number 12. The same cinematographer shot both 1957 Elmore Leonard adaptations. The two most celebrated westerns of 1957 were both drawn from Elmore Leonard stories, both produced at Columbia Pictures, and both photographed by the same man, a connection that almost never comes up in discussions of either film. Charles Buddy Lawton Jr. served as cinematographer on The Tall T and also on 3:10 to Yuma, directed by Delmer Daves and starring Glenn Ford and Van Heflin, which adapted Leonard's short story 3:10 to Yuma from Dime Western magazine. Both films now rank among the most studied westerns of the decade, and Lawton shot them both in the same year. His career had been built at Columbia since the mid-1940s, with over 100 credits covering an extraordinary range: The Lady from Shanghai for Orson Welles in 1947, The Long Gray Line and Two Rode Together for John Ford, and 3 entries in the Ranone cycle: The Tall T, Ride Lonesome, and Comanche Station. Born in Los Angeles in 1904 and gone by 1965, Lawton was the visual architect of 2 films in the same year that film scholars still write about, and his name rarely surfaces in conversations about either of them. Fact number 13. Randolph Scott was 59 years old and worth an estimated $100 million. 58 years old when the cameras rolled in the summer of 1956 and 59, at the time of the film's April 1957 release, Scott was producing some of the most artistically distinguished work of his career, at an age when most leading men in Hollywood had long since transitioned to character roles or retired outright. What ran alongside that late career artistic peak was a level of financial acumen that set him apart from nearly everyone else in the industry. Throughout his career, Scott invested heavily in real estate, oil wells, gas, and securities, and he invested in his own productions through the Scott-Brown partnership. Director André de Toth, who made 6 earlier westerns with Scott Brown, once complained that Brown and Scott were more interested in reading the Wall Street Journal than the script. By the end of his life, Scott's fortune had reportedly grown to approximately $100 million, placing him among the wealthiest actors Hollywood ever produced. His final film, Ride the High Country, directed by Sam Peckinpah in 1962 alongside Joel McCrea, came when he was 64, after which he retired permanently. During those retirement years, he attended Dodgers games with Fred Astaire, played golf, and maintained a close personal friendship with Reverend Billy Graham. March 2, 1987, at the age of 89, is when he died in Beverly Hills. Fact number 14. At the Detroit premiere, a film critic predicted a fistfight and got a shotgun to the face instead. Elmore Leonard told this story more than once, and it holds up every time. At a Detroit screening of The Tall T in April of 1957, Leonard sat among newspaper critics as the film approached its climax, the sequence where Randolph Scott's Pat Brennan uses Maureen O'Sullivan's Doretta Mims to draw Skip Homier's Billy Jack into the cave. At that moment, a critic who had seen enough B-westerns to have their narrative grammar fully memorized leaned back and announced with total confidence, "Here comes the obligatory fistfight." What happened instead was Randolph Scott grabbing a shotgun, pressing it under Skip Homier's chin, and pulling the trigger, turning the screen red. Leonard's summary of what followed: "They didn't say anything after that. And that silence is the whole point." The critic applied the correct analytical framework for approximately 95% of the westerns being made in 1957, and Bowditcher and Kennedy simply hadn't made that kind of film. The shotgun blast was a correction, delivered precisely and without warning to everyone in the room who thought they knew what was coming. If you're watching this and thinking that you need to see this film immediately, the answer is yes, you absolutely do. And while you're at it, please subscribe and drop a comment below telling us your favorite scene, because it genuinely helps the channel more than you know. Fact number 15. The film shared its theatrical opening with the only film ever starring both Ronald and Nancy Reagan. Columbia distributed The Tall T on a double bill with Hellcats of the Navy, also released in 1957, starring Ronald Reagan and Nancy Davis, and that pairing represents the only theatrical film in which the future President of the United States and the future First Lady appeared together on screen. Most audiences attending that double bill were likely there for the Reagan picture, given his continued name recognition and the patriotic novelty of Hellcats of the Navy's naval wartime premise. What they encountered alongside it was a picture that would eventually enter the Library of Congress and the Criterion Collection. The double bill format was standard practice for Columbia's programmers of that era, with B pictures packaged alongside other genre films of comparable budget and running time rather than standing alone. That framing tells you something specific about the distance between how films get received in the moment and how they get remembered later. The film, now considered one of the finest westerns ever made, spent its opening weeks as the companion piece to a presidential footnote, and nobody in that theater in 1957 could have told you which one would still be discussed 70 years on. Fact number 16. The film was added to the National Film Registry in the year 2000, the same year as Apocalypse Now and The Hustler. On December 27, 2000, Librarian of Congress James H. Billington announced the annual selection of films for the National Film Registry, the Library of Congress's preservation list for works deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, and the class of 2000 included Apocalypse Now and The Hustler. It also included The Tall T, placement alongside Francis Ford Coppola's Vietnam epic, and Robert Rosson's Pool Hall masterpiece, Is Not an Incidental Honor, and the selection of a 78-minute low-budget double-bill programmer in that cohort amounted to a formal declaration that this picture occupied the same category of lasting aesthetic achievement as the acknowledged prestige titles surrounding it. The AFI later nominated The Tall T in the Western category for their 10 Top 10 list in 2008, and while it didn't make the final 10, the nomination itself placed it in conversation with the genre's canonical titles. The registry selection had done the essential work of canonization 8 years earlier, and that status had been building for decades through the growing scholarly attention the Renault cycle attracted from the 1960s onward. Fact number 17. The screenwriter joined his parents' vaudeville act at age 4, and later earned the Silver Star in World War II. Bert Kennedy's parents performed in vaudeville under the billing The Dancing Kennedys, and at approximately age 4 or 5, young Bert joined their act, which is one of the more unexpected biographical origins for a man who would eventually write some of the most precisely calibrated dialogue in the Western genre. What followed the vaudeville years was World War II service as a first lieutenant in the 1st Cavalry Division during the liberation of the Philippines, earning the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster, the last of which indicates he sustained combat wounds more than once. After that came the Pasadena Playhouse, radio work, and eventually a contract with John Wayne's Batjack Productions. Boetticher's assessment of Kennedy's abilities was direct and unqualified, the best Western writer ever. Kennedy himself maintained a strict discipline throughout his career, writing 8 pages a day, every day, a consistency that reflected both the performance background and the military training, 2 worlds where precision and economy under pressure weren't optional. He later directed Support Your Local Sheriff in 1969 and The Train Robbers in 1973. And his memoir Hollywood Trail Boss appeared in 1997. Fact number 18. The film's composer won an Oscar for Yankee Doodle Dandy and secretly scored parts of Gone with the Wind. Heinz Rohmheld, who composed the score for The Tall T, began playing piano at the age of 4 in Milwaukee, and went on to study in Berlin under the legendary pianist and composer Ferruccio Busoni, performing with the Berlin Philharmonic before his career moved toward film. Over the course of that career, he scored music for over 400 films across multiple studios, and in 1942, he shared the Academy Award for Best Scoring of a Musical Picture with Ray Heindorf for Yankee Doodle Dandy, the James Cagney film that remains one of the defining patriotic pictures of the studio era. His uncredited work extended to Gone with the Wind, where he scored scenes including the burning of Atlanta, meaning that one of the most iconic sequences in Hollywood history carries his musical contribution without his name attached to it. After World War II, Rohmheld served as chief of the Film, Theater and Music section of the Information Central Division of the American Armies in Europe, before returning to Hollywood and continuing through the 1950s on pictures including the Renault westerns. As a biographical coda, his daughters married 2 well-known television game show hosts, with Mary Lou marrying Jack Nars and Anne marrying Bill Cullen. The man who won an Oscar for Yankee Doodle Dandy and ghost-scored Atlanta Burning was also eventually a game show father-in-law. Fact number 19. One of France's greatest film critics championed Boetticher the same year the film was released. The critical recovery of The Tall T and the Renault cycle often gets described as a slow, gradual process unfolding across decades, but serious critical attention arrived almost immediately after the films themselves, and from the most authoritative source available, André Bazin, co-founder of Cahiers du Cinéma and one of the most influential film critics of the 20th century, wrote the essay An Exemplary Western in the August-September 1957 issue of Cahiers, praising 7 Men from Now, the first film in the Renault cycle, for the perfection of a scenario which achieves the tour de force of ceaselessly surprising us within the terms of a rigorously classical framework. Cahiers du cinéma championed Baudelaire as one of their favored American auteurs, placing him alongside Hitchcock, Hawks, and Ford as directors operating at a high formal level inside commercial frameworks that most critics dismissed as product. The full English-language reckoning came later, with Peter Wallen's essay in 1965, Andrew Sarris's extended championing in the American cinema in 1968, and Jim Kitz's analysis in Horizons West in 1969. But Bazin was already pointing at the screen in the same year the cycle was still being made, identifying exactly what Baudelaire was doing and why it mattered. Fact number 20. The director said he could have swapped his hero and villain, and he meant it. Bud Baudelaire stated, on more than one occasion and without apparent irony, in every one of the Scott pictures he could have traded Randy's part with the villains. That observation functions as a precise description of the Randolph cycle's entire moral architecture, and nowhere does it land more accurately than in the tall T. Frank Usher knows what he is. His conversations throughout the film return again and again to a vision of the life he doesn't have, a house, a piece of land, a quiet woman, and those conversations reveal a yearning for exactly the existence Pat Brennan represents. Usher talks about the rancher's life the way a man talks about a country he was expelled from. He sees in Brennan what he might have become, and recognizes, without being able to act on the recognition, exactly where the divergence happened. Brennan, stripped of everything including his horse before the film is 30 minutes old, has an economy of violence that sits closer to Usher's world than to conventional heroism. He navigates that world without being shocked by it, understanding the logic of men like Usher from the inside. The distance between these two men is narrow and specific and moral, not temperamental, and the entire Western genre compresses into that single character dynamic. The fact that Baudelaire and Kennedy built that dynamic in 12 to 18 days, on a budget under $500,000, in a picture released as the companion piece to a Ronald Reagan naval film, is what makes The Tall T the kind of film critics are still writing about nearly 70 years after it opened. What makes The Tall T genuinely unusual in film history is that it was never supposed to matter. A B picture on a double bill, 78 minutes, marketed on a title nobody could explain, directed by a former matador, written by the son of vaudevillians, starring a man who would never see 60 again, featuring a henchman who'd never been near a horse. Made fast enough that a modern car drifted into the background of a frontier scene and stayed there. And then the Library of Congress put it in the National Film Registry alongside Apocalypse Now, and Scorsese recorded a video essay about it, and the Criterion Collection released it in 4K, and every critic who reviewed it said it was great. What you're looking at in The Tall T is what happens when people who know exactly what they're doing are freed from the obligation to make something important. Baudelaire wasn't chasing a masterpiece. He was making a picture in 18 days that was honest, precise, and morally clear, and he succeeded so completely that the rest of the world needed a few decades to understand what it had seen. The Tall T, 1957, 78 minutes. Now you know 20 things about it that most people don't. Go watch it again.